Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 3, Section 1. And we're looking at the political principles and major events that shaped how people form governments. Now, a few major terms that you're going to see are Constitution. That's the obvious one, right? It's a formal charter establishing the framework of our country. You'll see bicameral, Confederation, ratify, and I'll try to give you those in context as we go through. You're also going to see a few operational words like convert, area, impact. I'll try to give us a good context for. So a government's got to start somewhere. And, historically, peaceful transitions of power were a rarity until the beginning of the United States government. When the election of 2016 and all its drama occurred, and for better or worse, a new president assumed power. I think it's significant to note that the former president stepped down peacefully. The two obviously did not like each other. There are plenty of grievances both had against one another, but nonetheless, they respected the Constitution, and one stepped down, and the other assumed power. And and that takes a lot of accountability, because you can think also in history where that has not occurred. Say the story of Julius Caesar assumed emergency powers to put down a civil war, and when it was time to relinquish those powers, he refused, and he was murdered by the Senate. His appointed successor assumed power through yet another civil war, and eventually rose to power and declared himself emperor. And so how do you organize a government? Well, hopefully not through the massive bloodshed that we've seen in history. Hopefully careful planning. And so as we start to think about the first independent state governments, that's really where these things began. We had no form of national government until, really right before the Revolutionary War. We had the First and Second Continental Congress. And that was the closest that we had to any type of colonial national government. So if we really want to look at the beginnings of government in the United States, we have to look to the colonies and the states. So when the colonies organized as states, they wrote constitutions. And by that I just mean a detailed written plan for government. And I think, one of the interesting notes here is that none of these constitutions were perfect the first time around. I mean, all of these constitutions, including the United States one, leaves room for additions or subtractions. And so things can be changed, things can be overturned. But most of these state constitutions specified a bicameral legislature. And that means it has two parts or houses. So Tom Tillis is your United States Senator, representing half of North Carolina. Mark Meadows is your United States House of Representatives, representing us and several other counties. And so it's important to note that while Tom Tillis represents half the state, he and one other individual, each state have two votes. Each state has two votes. And then, and that's regardless of the state's size and population. But then, in regards to the House of Representatives, it goes by populations. We'll talk about that more later. But all of the states Constitutions provided for a governor elected by the people of the state and judges and courts. Okay. Now, most of these state constitutions are based around the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. The equality of all, and the idea that a government should not be able to tax its people without providing those people a say in the government. All of the state constitutions, just like the United States one, included a Bill of Rights. The North Carolina Constitution includes a Bill of Rights that guarantees certain basic freedoms and legal protections. They're outlined clearly, and so a big part of this class is teaching you your rights that you have from the government. The government has limitations in how they can deal with you, and that is important. And so you're going to learn those throughout this course. And so, what is the most important thing the Constitution provides? Part of this is dealing with a framework, governor, legislature, court system, etc. But then also you have to think, what's the most important to you? The framework of the government is designed to be representative, and so that's A, B, and D. But then C there is the Bill of Rights, your freedoms from the government. And so which is more important? It's a matter of preference. Now, you probably already know or may remember from American history that America 1.0 was a major failure. The Articles of Confederation was a major failure. And we'll get into some of the weaknesses of this. And so like Lauren was mentioning, the early American government was all based around the idea of protecting us from governments. The Anti-Federalists were very skeptical of any type of national government. And so the Articles of Confederation, and Confederation just means a group of individuals or state governments, loosely aligned. So a lot like the European Union. Germany is a nation, France is a nation. Both are a part of the European Union. They do work and collaborate on certain matters, but for the most part, they do their own thing. And so they are a confederation. So the Articles established a league of friendship among states. We were essentially a collection of independent countries. Now, the Articles were ratified by all 13 states. Ratified just means it was approved by vote. And the Articles set up a one-house legislature called the Confederation Congress. It was very simple. Every state had one vote, and for anything serious to be done, all the states had to agree. Now here's the really tricky part. The Articles of Confederation could approve laws. The Confederation Congress could approve laws, but it would be up to the individual states to enforce them. And so this had a lot of inherent flaws. The Confederation Congress did not even have the power to tax the states. There were a few things they did manage to accomplish, like the Ordinance of 1785, which set up a system for surveying and selling land, because immediately after the Revolution, one of the big things that we were doing was growing, that people were moving out into the frontiers. And so that was one of the few things that the actual Articles of Confederation did establish. In fact, the system works, and it's still in use today. Another of the accomplishments was the Northwest Ordinance, and it provided a way for territories to organize and become states. It's also important to note that even from the very beginning of our country, slavery was being regulated and outlawed in certain places. But of course, there were many weaknesses in the Confederation that are worth pointing out. For a law to be passed, 9 of the 13 states would have to agree. A supermajority. To change anything in the Articles of Confederation, all states would have to agree. And we've talked how hard it would be to get all of us in this room to agree on anything, much less anything of importance. And this is a major weakness. So, the Confederation Congress did not have the power to tax. They didn't have power to enforce their laws. So really all they are, it's kind of like a United Nations, if you will. They can come together, they can make agreements, they can pass laws, but it's up to each individual state to enforce those. And so since Congress was unable to enforce the law, we run into a lot of problems. You see, I know you guys were young when Saddam Hussein was captured and hung, but he had been in violation of international law in Iraq for quite some time. He had used chemical weapons on his own people, the Kurdish people to the north of Iraq. He had, allegedly was building weapons of mass destruction. That turned out to no evidence that was found, but he was suspected of it. And so the hurting his own people with chemical weapons is a violation of international law. And the United Nations passed a condemnation of his actions. So the United Nations all came together and they said, this guy's doing the bad thing. And we all know he's doing the bad thing. But here's the problem with the United Nations. They said, he's doing the bad thing, but we can't do anything about it. And so the United States stepped in and said, we're going to stop him from doing the bad thing. But we had to, it's up to those individual nations to do something about it. And so again, several inherent problems. Number one, we wouldn't have been able to fight the Revolutionary War without help from other nations. France and Spain loaned us money and supplies to fight the war. But the trouble with a loan, it's not a gift, it's a loan. And so we had debt. Like from the very beginning of our country's history, we had debt. And so the Confederation Congress needed a way to raise those funds. And so we were going to try to levy a tax on the people. And a man named Daniel Shays attacked a federal arsenal because he didn't want to have to pay taxes. He and his compatriots felt that the debt due by their state was causing their taxes to be too high, and so they led an armed attack on a federal arsenal. They didn't overthrow the government, but it sent a powerful message that, oh my gosh, if a bunch of angry farmers can just about overthrow a state government simply because they don't want to pay a tax, then we're going to have to figure out a way to be able to collect taxes and enforce laws. And so Shays' rebellion, even though he wasn't trying to overthrow the entire national government, it sent a powerful message. And people began to think, maybe we do need a stronger national government. So ultimately the Articles of Confederation were too weak. It's all based around that anti-federalist idea that strong national governments become tyrannical by default, but unfortunately in practice the Confederation proved too weak to survive.